Before the algorithms had names, before the conferences and the venture capital and the breathless headlines, there were just a handful of people in small rooms, staring at machines the size of refrigerators, wondering if something like thought could be coaxed into existence. It sounds almost romantic now. At the time, it felt closer to madness. The 1950s were a decade of grand ambitions, but they pointed mostly outward: rockets, reactors, the race to split the atom, and then, perhaps, to ride its energy into a new age. The scientific establishment had its hierarchies, its favored problems, its approved ways of spending money. And the idea that a machine might one day learn, might adapt, might do something other than exactly what it was explicitly told, that idea lived on the margins. It was tolerated the way eccentric uncles are tolerated at family dinners, smiled at, then quietly ignored. Yet the work continued, in underfunded corners of universities, in borrowed office space, in labs that smelled of solder and stale coffee. A small number of researchers were asking a different kind of question. Not how do we build a faster calculator, but how does the brain actually do what it does? And can we build something that does it too? It was a question that felt almost impolite, given the company. Norbert Wiener had already planted a seed with his ideas about feedback and control, about systems that respond to their environment rather than simply executing commands. Claude Shannon had shown that information itself could be measured, manipulated, treated as a physical thing. These were the intellectual sparks, scattered across disciplines, not yet gathered into anything that resembled a unified field. The people who would gather them were young, often unknown, working without roadmaps. What strikes you looking back is how little they had. No internet to search, no massive datasets to mine, no graphics cards burning through matrix multiplications at billions of operations per second. They had paper, pencil, and a stubborn conviction that the problem was worth solving. Some of them could not even get colleagues down the hall to take their work seriously. Grant committees returned proposals with polite rejections. Journal editors suggested the authors reconsider their framing. And still, the ideas accumulated. Quietly, almost secretly, a picture was forming. Not of a machine that computed, but of a machine that could, in some meaningful sense, learn from experience, adjust its behavior, improve. The word artificial intelligence had not yet been coined. The concept had no banner to rally around, no famous name attached to it, no moment of public birth. It was just a collection of sparks in the dark, each one small enough to be mistaken for nothing at all. But sparks, given the right conditions, do not stay small. And the sparks, it turns out, had already been doing work that no one would credit for years. In the early 1960s, a handful of researchers were building systems that could do something remarkable. They could change. Not in the way a thermostat changes, not in the simple sense of reacting to a signal. These systems could examine their own performance, measure it against a goal, and shift their internal structure accordingly. They were, in the most honest language available, learning. The word felt dangerous then, too bold, too close to a claim that nobody wanted to defend in public. One of the central ideas was what we might now call adaptive weighting, the notion that a system does not need to be told every rule explicitly, but can instead assign different levels of importance to different inputs and revise those levels each time it encounters new evidence. It sounds almost obvious today. At the time, it was a quiet revolution sitting in an unmarked drawer. The trouble was not that the ideas were wrong. The trouble was timing and politics and the brutal economics of academic attention. When funding agencies looked for results, they wanted demonstrations. They wanted machines that could answer questions, translate sentences, play games at a high level. What they got from these researchers was something harder to show. A system that was slowly getting better, a curve on a graph that pointed upward. Progress, yes, but not spectacle. And so the work was shelved, sometimes literally. Reports were filed, circulated among a small group, and then quietly buried when the next wave of enthusiasm arrived, promising faster answers through different means. The AI winters, when they came, did not simply freeze new development. They froze memory too. Whole lineages of thought went dormant, and when the thaw eventually arrived, the scientists who emerged into the warmth often believed they were discovering things for the first time. Attribution is a strange and fragile thing in science. It tends to follow the loudest voice, The most visible platform, the name attached to the paper that happened to land at the right moment. Several of the adaptive algorithms developed in this period were later reinvented, renamed, and celebrated as breakthroughs by researchers who had no knowledge of what came before. That is not a story of malice. It is a story of how thoroughly an idea can be erased when the institution around it collapses. What survived was not the credit. What survived was the logic itself, embedded in the structure of problems that kept demanding the same kinds of solutions. The questions those early researchers were asking never went away. The answers they had already sketched out were simply waiting, patient and unacknowledged, for the world to need them badly enough to look again. And eventually, it did. When the world finally looked again, it did not always see clearly. The modern AI renaissance arrived with enormous momentum, and with it came a particular mythology. The idea that machine intelligence had been conjured almost from nothing by a handful of brilliant minds working in well-funded laboratories over the past decade or two. That story is easier to tell. It has clean heroes and obvious funding trails, but it is not the whole story, and the parts it leaves out are not incidental. They are structural. What gets omitted from the origin story of a technology shapes how that technology gets built going forward. If you believe intelligence emerged from one kind of mind, working in one kind of place, under one kind of condition, then you will naturally assume the next generation of breakthroughs will look the same. You will fund the same institutions. You will hire from the same pipelines. You will repeat the exclusions without ever meaning to, simply because you never learned to see them as exclusions in the first place. This is why recovering the blueprint matters, not as an act of nostalgia, and not merely as a gesture toward fairness, though fairness is reason enough. It matters because the blueprint was better than we knew. The researchers who are written out of the canonical history were not peripheral. They were foundational. Their methods informed architectures that still run beneath the surface of systems we use today. Their theoretical instincts pointed toward problems that took decades for the mainstream to rediscover. Erasing them did not make the field stronger, it made the field amnesiac. And an amnesiac field keeps stumbling into the same walls. Reclaiming that history is an act of engineering as much as it is an act of justice. When we understand that rigorous, generative work came from places and people that institutional memory chose to forget, we begin to see that the pipeline we treat as natural is actually a choice. Narrow pipelines were built. They can be rebuilt differently. The AI systems being developed right now will influence how billions of people work, make decisions, access resources, and understand themselves. The teams designing those systems carry assumptions about whose intelligence counts, whose intuitions are worth encoding, whose edge cases deserve attention. Those assumptions do not appear out of nowhere. They come from a field's self-image, from who it celebrates, from whose portraits hang on the walls, and whose names appear in the introductory lectures. Put different names in those lectures, and something shifts. Not immediately, and not without friction, but the shift is real. The field begins to recognize a wider range of problems as worth solving, a wider range of people as capable of solving them. The pioneers were always part of the foundation. Acknowledging that does not rewrite history. It finally gets history right, and getting it right is the only honest way to build what comes next.